first started out, and we chose the book of Galatians, and I tried to start planning it out, right? And had my plans about how it would go. I thought we would get through this first chapter pretty quick. I mean, it is mostly biographical in nature. Paul is telling us his story, and so for that reason, I thought, we'll kind of fly through this. We'll get through chapter 1 in a couple sermons. But this Thursday, Alicia and I were out, and God just simply dumped. She went to the bathroom, and I checked something, and God just dumped a whole bunch of stuff on me that I felt like we're supposed to talk about. And so I really cut everything in half, and we'll finish the rest of chapter 1 next week. Doesn't mean that the sermon's going to be half. Sorry. Time, but I'm going to keep an eye on it because he gave me a lot more material. But I'm excited about it because we're talking about calling. We're talking about, and I titled it, The God Calling, because he has called us. He has chosen us, right? But he also has a calling on our life, each and every one of us. And he is always calling to us if we are willing to tune in and listen to him. I think most of us here remember times before cell phones, growing up. And the phones were always a big deal. Alicia and I, we would talk on the phone all the time. I just lived down the street, and she lived about 1.5 miles that way. But we were always talking, and it was not uncommon to hear my parents pick up the phone on the other side and say, "Nathan, it's time to get off the phone." "Alicia, Nathan's got to go now. See ya." And so that was part of our reality. And with those phones, you wanted to be careful about who got on them, right? Because if my sisters were going to get on the phone, I was like, "Who are you going to talk to?" Because I'm expecting a call. So you can't talk for too long. So you were worried about who was going to get on it. And then call waiting came along, and that was impressive. Now I have people lined up to talk to us that we can switch back and forth to. And I actually had a friend, and his dad had an office in his house. And thank you very much. And his dad had an office in his house, and he had a conference phone, so we could actually conference in a bunch of people. And we thought that was like technological sorcery at the time. We could get a whole bunch of people in talking. But, it was all about, who called while I was out? Or who should I be talking to right now? Or who am I expecting a call from in the future? And now kids don't even really talk on the phone, right? And text and DM and all this kind of stuff. But even though all the ways that we have communicated change, the message is pretty much the same. And so I titled this God Calling because of some truths that we see in the life of Paul, which are true in us too. And I just mentioned them, but it is the first time we met, we talked about how we are called into relationship. And in verse 15, Paul says in this section that God set him apart before he was born. And so he had called him out. And so that is a whole nother sermon in and of itself, talking about, did we choose God? Did he choose us? God's sovereignty versus free will, and where does that come into play? And the answer is very simple. The answer is yes. That we do need to make a decision, right, to follow him, but he has also chosen us. And I don't want to pretend to know how that works, but if you want to know if you're chosen, then just go ahead and make a choice, and then you'll know if you're chosen or not. So he has called you. He has a calling on your life, a purpose, and he is also calling you currently if we are willing to tune in and listen. It doesn't really matter what season of life you're in. He wants to talk to you. He is active. He's always active. And that's why he calls us to be active. We call this a Christian walk, right? We don't call it the Christian camping site. So we're not supposed to stand still. We're supposed to be active with him and partner with him. We can't live on things that happened 5 months ago, right? Or even 5 years ago. Things that God told us. We need to be in constant communication with him if we want to have a relationship. So we can start with a little more background on Paul. Last week we talked about a little bit about his conversion. And Paul was on the way to Damascus, and along the way God interrupts his plan and knocks him off his high horse as he is going to Damascus, try to find some followers of the way so he can bring them back in chains. And God totally rocks his world. Whatever vision Paul thought he was going to have in going there to accomplish things for God, he took away. And so he actually gets blinded as he is led into the city. And he is there for 3 days. 3 days sitting in the dark, no food, no water. And that number 3 should ring a bell with us, 3 days. Because that number, I talked about how names are significant in the Bible, but numbers are also very significant. And that number 3 throughout the Bible represents wholeness or completeness. You have Jesus that was in the tomb for 3 days. You have Moses who, when he went to Pharaoh, said, listen, we need to take a 3-day journey into the desert to worship God. Jonah was in the belly of a whale for 3 days. Esther, when Esther talked to Mordecai, and she said, have the people pray and fast for 3 days before I go in and meet with the king. So a little bit of homework for you if you want to. You can look throughout the Bible. It's all throughout the number 3 and what it pertains to. So Paul is sitting in the dark for 3 days. And what is he doing? Well, the Jesus that he was trying to stamp out just leveled him and spoke to him audibly. Everything he knew, he was a student. He was the best in his class. And God had just changed everything that he thought he knew. And what he knew was the Old Testament. He knew all of that. He would have known the Torah. He would have known all the Psalms, the Proverbs, and all the prophets. He would have known that. And I think as he's sitting there for 3 days in the dark, that he is just pouring over all of these scriptures in his mind, everything he knows about who the Messiah would be and where he would come from and how he would die. And I think after that 3-day period of time that his heart was ready. You know, that his heart had gotten plowed up over that three-day period of time, and he was ready to receive what God wanted to get him, if that makes sense. In Matthew 13, Jesus is talking to a group of people, and he is telling them about the parable of the sower. And back then they would wear these sacks over their shoulders, and they would just be filled with seed, and they'd just be walking down the rows, throwing seed. And so we'll just go ahead and read it. In 13, and this is in verse 3. Jesus said, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. It's called the parable of the sower, but it really could be called the parable of the soils, because that's really the point of what Jesus is talking about. There's only one sower, right, Jesus, and the seed is the gospel. But you have all these different types of soil that the seed is falling on. And, Jesus' disciples come up to him and they say, listen, you're always talking in parables, and it's kind of hard to understand sometimes. Why do you do that? And Jesus said, an old prophecy that I preach in parables so that in hearing they won't hear, and in seeing they won't see. And it's kind of a confusing statement, like, doesn't really make sense what you just said, but there's the Holy Spirit that opens up people's eyes and their ears and their hearts. He's saying, listen, the people that, there's the soil of their heart, when it's ready, those are the people that are going to hear. But the ones who have the rocky soil, the ones that are hard, that are distracted by the cares of this world. And what Jesus was saying is, because of Satan, because of circumstances in our lives, or because of decisions that we've made, that's going to determine whether or not that soil takes root, or whether it's just going to wither away. I don't know anything about farming, but I do know that in that day and age, this would have been, that 160, 30-fold would have been a supernatural amount of harvest. When people heard that, they would have said, that doesn't, like, this guy must not know anything about farming. That's impossible. But what Jesus was getting at is that when his word, when his seed gets inside of you, it's going to produce supernatural fruit. And then God calls this guy by the name of Ananias. And I don't know why, but every time I read this, I was always enthralled with Ananias. I just love the story Because he was listening. He was listening. His name means Yahweh has been gracious. That's what Ananias means. Which is incredible because this is one of the best stories of grace, of God taking Paul and totally transforming his life, regardless of what he's done. And we talked about it last week, that's what grace is. It is God's riches at Christ's expense. Right? So Christ paid it all, but we get all of the riches. It's amazing what God will do with people that are simply available. Right? Ananias was just available. He was tuned in. He was listening to God. God doesn't always use, thankfully, he doesn't always use a megaphone to get our attention. Right? Most of the time, he's talking in a still small voice. And if we're not tuned in, then we're not going to hear him. And so Ananias has put himself in a position where he can hear from God. When I talk to my kids, I would rather not yell to get their attention. I really would. One of the best conversations we have, we're just sitting around the table talking or sitting in their rooms talking. And I want to have a conversation with them. I don't want to yell at them, and I think they appreciate that, probably. Yeah. And in 1 Kings 19, we hear about Elijah. And Elijah was used to talking to God. Like God would talk to Elijah. And in 1 Kings 19, this is verse 11. And he said, and this is God talking, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper." Has anybody seen, one of our favorite movies to watch this time of the year is called The Nativity. Has anybody seen the Nativity movie? If you have, it's really good. And in that movie, they are teaching the kids over and over this passage of Scripture from the time they're little, letting them know God's talking, but he's talking in a way where you have to be quiet yourself to be able to hear him. And in our day and age, there are so many things that flood our minds. The earthquakes, right, represent the earthquakes and the winds and the fires, distractions that get on our head. And if we don't purposely set time aside to listen, then we're not going to hear what he has to say. How do we do that? How do we listen for God? This is probably one of the biggest ways, reading through his word, also through worshiping and listening to sermons, or journaling is a big one. The importance of daily devotions. But tuck that away. We're going to come back to that at the end. But Ananias didn't just listen. He obeyed. And we can listen to a lot of different things. We have access to so much right now. And we can hear and we can listen, but we may not take action. And if we don't take action, then it doesn't really mean anything. Jesus, when he was talking to people, and he would say, and when people would say, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear," that was always a strange statement to hear from Jesus, to say that. The connotation was, if you understand what I'm saying, then do it. Be obedient. And Ananias, he had more than just a head knowledge of God. He had a heart knowledge. He had a relationship with God. And this is kind of hard to say, but some people will miss heaven by 18 inches. You may have heard people say that before. Some people have a head knowledge of God, but unless it travels from here to here, and it causes you to take action to have a relationship, then in the end it's not really going to make a difference. But Ananias didn't put it off. He didn't think about it for a couple days and say, "I don't know if that was really God. Like, that's really uncomfortable. I don't know if God would tell me to do that." He didn't go talk to some friends about it and say, "You're never going to believe what God told me." He went and did it. We have this saying that we tell our kids in the house, and we did it from the time they were really little, and sometimes we even say it now. But Elena, what do we say? We say, slow obedience, no obedience, right? Slow obedience is no, so we try to motivate them that way sometimes. And so he did not wait. He went and did what God told him to do. there's a story about Mark Twain. And Mark Twain, in all of his travels, he met a guy, and he was real brash. He was a ruthless, just businessman. And Mark Twain was listening to him, and he was boasting that whenever he had it in his mind, whenever he was determined to do something, nobody could stop him. Nobody could get in his way. And he said, one of these days, I'm going to take a trip to the Holy Land, and I'm going to march up Mount Sinai. And when I get up there, I am going to yell and read the Ten Commandments at the top of my voice. And Mark Twain's listening to this, and he says, I got a better idea. Why don't you stay in Boston and keep them? So we can have head knowledge about God. We can memorize stuff, but if it doesn't result in an action that creates a relationship, then it's not going to make much of a difference. But Ananias does have a conversation with God about it. That's important to note too. He didn't wait, but he did have a conversation. He said, God, this guy, I've heard of this guy, and he locks up and kills people like me. So you want me to go approach him? And God says to him, I've called him. I've chosen him. And he's going to carry my name to the Gentiles. And he says, go and do it. And so not only did Ananias listen, and not only did he obey, but he also believed, which is important. He wasn't skeptical. Because when he walks in, and this is powerful stuff, I don't know if I would be able to do this, but he walks in and he calls him Brother Saul. I mean, he's never even met him in person before. He's just heard of all these terrible things that he's done. And he walks in and says, Brother Saul. And this is part of Ananias' calling. We need to partner with us. God calls us into partnership to do this. We talked about it in the first week, where Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, but then he asked people to go and loose him, unbind him, because he was wrapped up in all his grave clothes. And he has asked Ananias, Jesus said, I've woken him up. Right? I have showed him who I am, and I want you to go. Pray for him that his eyesight will be restored and that he would be unbound. So then he launches out into his calling, and Saul is converted, and he becomes even more radical, I would suggest, than he was beforehand when God gets a hold of him. And now we finally get to read our passage of Scripture for today. I said last week that was all introduction. All right, so we're going to read verses 11 through 17. Paul is called by God. It says, For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached to me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life of Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and I returned to Damascus. I mentioned that the first two chapters are really his bio. He's telling us why he is qualified to bring this message. And today we would just call that a testimony, right? It's proof that something is real, that something has happened. And so that's what he's doing here. Not very many things have as much impact as a personal story. Our family loves movies. We like to watch some of these big epics for our family. It is things like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and Chronicles of Narnia, things like this. And they're types of things that make you want to be a part of them, these struggles between good and evil. Did anybody watch The Chosen this week that hadn't watched it yet? You guys watched it? Good. It's good. It's good, isn't it? One of my favorites right now. So they don't really leave you asking a lot of questions. Like, they're entertaining, but they don't leave you asking a lot of questions. And when you see somebody who used to be one way, and then all of a sudden is completely different, you have to ask some questions. I mentioned before that there was a church service that I was sitting in, and in between services, I stood up and I turned around and I saw this guy that I used to go to school with. And the first thought that popped into my mind was, what is he doing here? Which was terrible. And then God immediately convicted me that, what are you doing here? Like, we're all saved by grace. But what it did is it made me ask questions. I went up to him and I just, I had to introduce myself to him again and say, we need to get together so I can hear your story. I want to know what happened. And in that series, The Chosen, the character that really just breaks me up is Nicodemus. And he is searching. He's searching for what God is doing and his Messiah. And he sees this woman that had been demon-possessed. And then he sees her after the fact, after Jesus has set her free. And it just boggles him, and he becomes obsessed with questions. And he's chasing her down, trying to find out what in the world happened, which would have been very weird in that day. The men did not talk to the women, and especially women like her, going to the places in town where she lived. But he becomes obsessed with these questions. And the Holy Spirit is drawing him in. And literally, Jesus goes and meets with him and tells him, look, you're the teacher of Israel. You're the main guy. And I'm here to tell you that all of the things that you've been doing, the rules that you're trying to keep, you can't do it. You have to actually be born again. Like, it's not about you, it's about me. Here's the truth of trying to keep things in our own strength. This year, in 2021, there will be 189 million people make New Year's resolutions. 189 million people. And here's a crazy statistic. 55% of them are pretty sure they can do it. Only 55% think it's in the cards. 45% are pretty iffy. They kind of doubt that they can do it, but they're going to go ahead and make that New Year's resolution anyway. Not a great way to start out. There was an article I read that was talking about self-help books. And over the years, it's just grown exponentially. And in 2019, there were about 19.5 million books that were sold just in the self-help category. And since 2013 to 2019, that number doubled. So in a short period of time, people are looking for more and more ways to be inspired, to be motivated to do the things that they want to do. And it ain't working. And worldwide, health apps now are the big thing, right? You can just download an app and have it motivate you for your health or your activity. And the top 10 health apps generated over 18.5 million downloads, right, worldwide. So 19.5 million self-help books, 18.5, and that was over the course of the year, 18.5 health app downloads just in the month of September this year. Just in the month of September. So people are looking for ways that they can motivate themselves, but it's not really working. Paul's telling the Galatians, saying, look, I've tried it. I was the best at it, and it's not working. I didn't come up with this on my own. I didn't go up a mountain and study with a guru or, chant for hours on end to get to this doctrine. He tells them, I got it directly from the source. I didn't even get it from the disciples. I didn't get it from the guys who walked with him for 3 years. He doesn't even go to Jerusalem for 3 years. Now, Jerusalem to Damascus is about 150 miles. So a serious trip in that day would have probably taken almost 2 weeks. But it wasn't too far for him to go persecuting the church. But he knew that he had the message directly from the source, and he didn't need to go to Jerusalem. And that's what he's telling them. I had a friend who, I think it was in August, he was on a mission to do 1,000,000 steps. And so he had this watch that would tell him how many steps, and he was going to do 1,000,000 steps. And every day he was walking between 18 and 20 miles to get his steps in. And so I would watch his progress, and I was like, I could do this. I want to try it. So I would launch out. And I walked for about 2 hours solid. I mean, fast paced. And I got about 10 miles. And I did that for a couple days. I'm like, this is stupid. I can't do this every day. I don't have 2 hours every day to do that. But Paul knew better than anyone the message of grace. And part of the purpose, part of the reason for Paul's story is to show you and I that we haven't gone too far. Right. I mean, has anyone in here been an accessory to murder? I mean, probably shouldn't raise your hand. But I don't think any of us have been an accessory to murder. But in Acts 7:58, telling the story about the first Christian martyr, Stephen. And it says in verse 58, so this is chapter 7 of Acts, verse 58. It says that they cast him, and that's Stephen, out of the city, and they stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now, it could be that he was just standing in the wrong place. Like, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and everybody just starts throwing their coats down at his feet. But to clear that up, he says in chapter 20, verse 20, I think it's actually verse 20 or 22. It's actually Acts 22:20. And it says, when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments who killed him. So he clears all that up and says, actually, I was approving of everything that was going on. I may not have thrown a stone, but I was there approving of the whole thing. I was doing a study on Romans with Mark and some other guys. We were going through Romans. And in the first chapter, he is talking about all of these similarities that are happening in that day and what are happening in America right now. He starts listing out this whole group of sins that coincide with a culture that is circling the toilet bowl, really. And the last part of it, he talks about that they know, though they know God's righteous decree, that those that practice these sins that he goes through in chapter 1 deserve to die. They not only practice them, but they approve of them that do. So not only do they do them, but they approve of them they do. And Paul was looking on approvingly, and we see this in our world right now, these messages of acceptance, right? And tolerance and approval. And we're even seeing it in the church, unfortunately. And the only thing that I can conclude is that either folks aren't reading their Bibles, or they don't believe it. So they're either not reading or they don't believe it. Because he says they were looking on approvingly of the people that were doing it. It's a theme throughout the Bible that wherever God is opposed, wherever the gospel meets opposition, that the church just grows. It actually furthers God's purposes. When they went to the edge of where they knew Christianity was growing here in Damascus, and they had a really big group of people that were Christians there, it only served to push them out throughout Asia and throughout Greece and to Rome and Galatia. So it had the opposite effect. As they were trying to persecute, it actually spread. And there is the temptation now to think that because some of our rights, some of our freedoms are being questioned, being infringed upon, not being able to meet in church or being limited and all the things that are going on with restrictions, that there's a little bit of persecution going on, which is, we shouldn't be confused. That's not what's going on right now at all. In fact, in Paul's day, the Caesar that was ruling was Caesar Nero, who was mad by all accounts. And he did all kinds of horrible things. One of the things that he would do, because he hated Christians, is that he would actually make them into human candles. Like, he would dip them in wax and use them to light his garden parties. And he loved to ride chariots, so he would get in his chariot, totally naked, and he would ride through his gardens as these candles are lit, and he would scream at the top of his lungs, "Now you are the light of the world." And that's what he would do. So, but even in the face of that type of persecution, the church was growing. Couldn't stop it. Keith Green, if any of you know Keith Green, the singer, love Keith Green, and he actually had a song that's very powerful, very convicting, called "Asleep in the Light." And he is addressing that song directly to the church, to Christians here in America that have access and freedoms like nobody else in the world, and yet a lot of people are complacent. A lot of people are kind of take it or leave it. And in Revelations 3, we actually see Jesus coming onto the scene, and he shows up to John, and John's on the island of Patmos. I think we talked about this last week. They tried to kill him. All of the disciples died brutal deaths. They tried to kill him by boiling him in oil, but it didn't work. And so they ship him out to Patmos, and he's there by himself. And Jesus shows up and tells him to start writing things down. And so in chapter 3, this is verse 15, Jesus is telling John to write these letters to different churches, 7 different churches. And this one that he has him write is to the church in Laodicea. And so in chapter 15, he says, I know your works, that you're neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot or cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing, and not realizing that you're wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked. Laodicea was a major banking center in that region, and they were very prosperous. It was like Wall Street in Galatia. They were very into entertainment. They had an amphitheater that could hold 30,000 people that they had built in this area. Today we have stadiums that seat 80,000 people for our entertainment. They had this in their day. But the church had grown soft. They had grown indifferent. Right? Kind of take it or leave it. If I have time in my schedule, I'll see if I can fit that in. Maybe we'll get together. So they had grown pretty lukewarm. I love coffee. Alicia does. We drink a lot of coffee. I don't know if you can drink too much. Mark, maybe just too late at night. We do sometimes. But I like hot coffee. I like iced coffee. Have you ever had room temperature coffee? It's pretty gross. Sometimes I'll go out hunting and I'll have coffee to go out there and wake me up at 5 in the morning. And I'll come back after 5 hours, come back to the car, and I'll be super thirsty, and I'll have my coffee sitting there, and I think about it. Like, all right, I'm going to take a drink, and it's lukewarm, and it's terrible. It makes me want to spit it out. Obviously, there are lots of opinions, interpretations of the book of Revelation. It's really not that hard to understand, and someday we'll get there. That's a joke. But I happen to side with a lot of Bible scholars and teachers that believe that these letters that Jesus was having John write to the churches, these 7 churches, represent the 7 ages of the church. That the church is going through 7 ages, and this letter to the church in Laodicea is the 7th one. It's the last one. And he's talking to a group of Christians, to churches that have been very prosperous, that have been very spoiled, if you will, but have grown weak and soft in their faith. All right, back to Galatians, and this is verse 16. Lost my place. It says that he was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Why did God choose Paul? Simply because it pleased him. It pleased him to do so because of his love and for his glory. For his glory. That is one of the parts that I was going to cover this weekend. I'm actually going to cover all of that next weekend, which I'm very excited about. But everything that God does, literally everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, serves to produce massive amounts of glory for him. It's all about everything that happens in here is for his glory. Baby reveals, gender reveals are the big thing right now. We had one when the kids were little. It wasn't like they do right now, but we had gone into the doctor to find out what we were going to be having. And we had Devin, and we had Elena and Kyla, and this is when Alicia was pregnant with Sammy. And we were all in the room together. I don't know why we had all the kids with us, but we did. And we're all in the room, and they told us that it was going to be a girl. And when they said that, Devin melts down in the room, right? He starts crying. I'm not trying to embarrass you. It embarrassed me, okay? So he starts crying in the room. And so we walk out of the room, and the girls, Elena and Kyla are just skipping along. They're super happy. We're having another girl, and Devin's crying. And we're walking through the waiting room, and there's this new parent, like they're pregnant, they don't have any kids yet, and they're staring at us like, as we walk through there, Devin's crying, and the girls are just skipping along. So it made somebody happy. But when God revealed his Son, it was for his glory. All right, and the second half of verse 16, the second half of this, it says, I did not consult with anyone. I didn't consult with anyone. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia. Paul heads into the desert for a time of isolation. He goes in there for isolation. He needed some answers. He needed some direction. God had revealed himself to Paul, and he said, I need to go into the desert to get some direction. The desert in the Bible is symbolic of testing. It's symbolic of reliance on God. A lot of the prophets lived in the desert. Elijah lived in the desert, lived in a cave for a while in isolation. Moses spent 40 years in isolation watching sheep before God called him into a desert. He wasn't alone then, no isolation with 3 million people going through the desert, but God called him there. You have John the Baptist, who lived in the desert wearing leather underwear and chomping on grasshoppers. He was a different guy. People thought he was pretty crazy. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days when he was being tested as he was tempted by Satan. These were places of isolation. They were seeking God, but they also knew that while God was calling them, that they could find the phone out there too. That they could be away from the distractions, all of the things that would fill their mind, and they could have a conversation with God. They were pursuing us. And you and I, all of us, need times of isolation with the Lord. Reading his word, taking notes, worshiping, praying. It's where our faith grows, honestly. In isolation is where our faith grows. If you think about it, we talked about seeds earlier. Seeds grow in the ground, in isolation, in the darkness, in the place where nobody can see them. That's where your faith grows. The seeds that are on top of the soil, nothing happens there. There's no root. There's no fruit, right? If we want to see a miracle happen, if we want to see something happen before we grow our faith, before we believe, we're going to be like the Jews in his day that said, listen, Jesus, show us a sign. We want to believe, just show us a sign and then we'll believe. And Jesus said, no, you're not going to get a sign. Because even if I do a sign, you're going to want another one. Your faith's not going to grow. You're just going to be impressed by a miracle. And he said, the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. And so, what we need to do is engage God in a conversation. How do we know when miracles happen? Because we have prayed, we have asked for, we have believed for them, and that is what's going to grow our faith. That is the type of faith that pleases God, when we engage him. Now, I love being in God's house. I love being in church, and it's one of my favorite things. But I can tell you that as a dad, I can be in the house and lose out on relationship. Because I can be busy. I can be the one that funds everything. I can be the one that makes things happen. I can be around and support. But if I'm not intentionally engaging Alicia or engaging my kids, then there's not going to be a relationship developing. And that's what we need to be doing. In James 4:8, he says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. We're double-minded when we're not quite committed to God, but we're not committed to the world. Like, we have just enough of God in us to not be able to enjoy the world, but we have just enough of the world in us to not be able to enjoy Jesus. Right. Jeremiah 29, 12 and 13, he says this. He says, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your hearts. God always keeps his word. He always keeps his word. If we seek him with our whole heart, he will meet us. That's what he said. We have to believe that, and we have to live with that expectancy. Remember Daniel in the lion's den? We don't think about this one a lot, but he needed an answer, and he prayed to God, and it took 21 days for him to get an answer. 21 days. And when the angel finally shows up, he says, listen, I was sent out the moment you prayed. I was sent out. But I was resisted by a demon. He calls the prince of Persia. He was resisted. And the archangel Michael actually had to come and free him up so that he could bring the answer to Daniel. And it took him 21 days. And I just wonder if times that we pray 5 times, we pray 12 times, before we kind of say we give up, you know. We're like, nothing's happening. Why keep praying? I've prayed about it for months. But do we give up too early before the answer comes? And I think the seeking, you know, the phone works both ways. You know, God is speaking to us, but we also can go to him and speak to him with expectancy. There was an Old Testament prophet called Habakkuk. And I'm just happy I get to say Habakkuk this morning. This is part of what God gave me, and I'm like, really, Habakkuk? Cool. This will be fun. I use the Old Testament a lot because for every New Testament principle, there's an Old Testament picture, right? And in this Old Testament picture, we have Habakkuk, and it's unique in that, as a prophet, he was not bringing a word to the people. He was not bringing a word of warning or judgment. He is having a conversation with God. And he is questioning God's goodness because of all of the evilness, because of all of the, you know, things that the people were doing. And he's like, God, you're pure. How do you look at all this and not do anything? And so he's questioning God. And God answers him and says, I am going to do something. Actually, I'm raising up the Chaldeans who are going to come in and devastate this country and punish the Israelites. And Habakkuk freaks out. And he's like, what? Like, they're worse than we are. How is that fair? And God says, don't worry, they're going to get theirs too. But here's what's going to happen. And Habakkuk continues this conversation, and he says, I have to go back and get some more answers from God on this. And it says that he purposefully sought God. And so we're going to read this here, what Habakkuk said. And this is in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. It says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And in the very next verse, verse 2, it says, and the Lord answered me. So, this section is actually titled, The Righteous Shall Live by Faith. This is where that came from. As God's speaking to Habakkuk, he mentions in this chapter, in chapter 2, that the righteous, the just, will live by faith. This passage right here actually inspired a young man. He was in a storm, a very violent storm that was happening, and he did what a lot of people have done in years past, where he says, Lord, if you will get me out of this, I'll serve you for the rest of my life, right? And he's true to his word. God delivers him. He does not die in the storm. And so he was in law school at the time. He withdraws from law school. He goes to become a monk. And when he's there, he is having the same problem. He is looking at all the evil in the world, and he's trying to figure out, how can God be good when all of this stuff is happening? And he writes in his diary over and over, how can man earn God's favor? And so he falls into all kinds of legalism, and he's trying to keep rules, and he's inflicting pain on his body to try to earn favor. And he would go to confession multiple times during the day. Every time he had, a wrong thought or a wrong desire, he would run and do that. And one of the monks said, listen, either go out and commit a sin worth confessing or stop coming in here. And then one day, he was taking a pilgrimage to Rome. And, before that, there was an older monk that was noticing this struggle that he was going through and said, listen, you need to go read the book of Habakkuk, which wouldn't have been my first recommendation, to read the book of Habakkuk, but he says, you need to go read Habakkuk. So he does, and he reads about how the righteous, the just, shall live by faith. And he is actually, on this pilgrimage, he goes to Rome, and as he's there, he is going up these steps. And in these steps, when they would worship, they would kind of crawl up these steps, and there were all these tiles on there that they believed were the actual steps and tiles that Jesus' blood had fallen when he was on the road to be crucified. And somehow they had magically been transported to Rome after that event. But he is actually crawling up these steps, and he's whipping himself, and he's doing all of these prayers, and it hits him right in the middle. The righteous shall live by faith. And it says at that moment, he stood up, and he turned around, and he walked down the stairs. And his life at that point was changed forever. And that person's name was Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who started the Reformation, one of those important events in all of our history. 95 Theses, nailed him to the door, branded a heretic for all of that, all because Habakkuk was obedient and determined to set himself in a place where he was going to have a conversation with God. And then Paul picks that up, and later on in Galatians, and also in Romans, and then in the book of Hebrews, which we think that he might have written, he carries this theme through those, that the righteous will live by faith. Now, one of the things that is important, there's three things I think are important to know about Habakkuk here, and it's his determination. He said, I am going to go up to the watchtower. I am placing my God. I'm not going to let anything else distract me. Paul went to the desert because he was determined. He was going there with expectancy that he was going to hear something from the Lord. And I wonder at times if our determination is lacking, if we don't be intentional about seeking the Lord and putting ourselves in a place where we're away from our email, away from our phones, right? Away from the TV. The second was his isolation. He didn't want to be bothered with anything else. He didn't want anything else from the world to be entering into his ears, into his mind. He went there with a singular purpose. If he wanted to hear, then he had to seek. Sometimes we think that following God is like hide and seek. You know, we're trying to find him. We're trying to look for him so that we can. But really, in reality, if we want to hear, then we got to seek. He's not hiding from us. He's waiting there if we'll just come to him. So there's no shortcuts. There aren't any alternatives to a quiet place and a quiet time. The third was his expectation. So his determination, his isolation, and then also his expectation. He says, I will look out to see what he will say to me. Not what he might say to me, not what I hope he's going to say to me, or even what I wish he would say to me. He said, I'm going there to hear what he's going to say to me. In Hebrews 11:6, Hebrews 11, and again, this is one we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. I think it might be Paul. He says in verse 6, and without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So not only do we have to believe that he exists, we also have to believe that he will reward us by meeting with us when we seek him. We really need to be careful that we don't adopt a laid-back mentality when it comes to seeking the Lord, wondering if, well, I wonder if there's going to be anything for me in the Bible today. If God will say anything, probably not. Don't know if there's going to be much there. We need to approach him expectantly with what he's going to say. And I would even recommend with a journal or writing something down. There was a method that we used to do called the SOAP method. And some of us in here have done that, where you read a scripture and then you observe what it says, and then you look for an application of how you can apply that scripture to your life, and then at P is for prayer. So scripture, observation, application, and prayer. And that is a good way when you're reading just to take in the things that God is telling you. But if we choose not to isolate ourselves, if we choose to ignore that, then what are we going to do when the test comes? Because the tests do come. In Matthew 17, Jesus has just gone through what we call the transfiguration. He's up there with Peter, James, and John, and it says that he starts to glow, and Elijah and Moses are meeting with Jesus there. And after that mountaintop experience, they go back down in the valley, because we know that our mountaintop experiences are awesome, and we love them, but we're not called to live there. Actually, Peter says, we should live here. And Jesus says, no, we got to go back. That's not why we're here. We got to go back down to the valley. And in the valley is where the testing is. And they get down there, and a guy brings his son to Jesus who is demon-possessed, and he says, Jesus, please heal my son. I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And Jesus is like, oh. Literally, he says, how much longer do I have to bear with you people? Which is surprising to me that Jesus said that, but he was a little bit frustrated that his disciples weren't casting it out. And so they asked him about it. They're like, listen, after Jesus, boom, heals him. And they said, why couldn't we heal him? And so Jesus says this in Matthew. Let's see if I can find it here. He says, because of your little faith. He told them, for I assure you, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, he's comparing faith to seeds again, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not come out except by prayer and fasting. They had to be prepared beforehand. I mean, I could see them at the time saying, well, we didn't know. Well, yeah, we would have prayed and fasted if we would have known that this was coming today. But they had to be prepared beforehand. We hear about athletes and about performers that when they got their big break, for whatever reason, they say they really rose to the occasion. But the reality is that it was the months and the years of preparation that nobody saw that allowed them to perform at that level when they got the opportunity. And if they had not done that, there would be no rising to the occasion. And Jesus is saying, you have to put yourself in those moments of isolation. You need prayer. You need your times of relationship with God so that when the test comes, you'll be ready. Otherwise, and we tell our kids this, when you go, you need to make your mind up ahead of time before you get in that situation. Because once you're facing that test, that pressure, that thing that's going to happen, that's going to put you in an area where you need to make a choice. You need to have made that choice beforehand. Because when you get there, the temptation might be more than you can handle. So you got to do that beforehand. I'm convinced that life feels like one pop quiz after another. Anybody else feel that way? One pop quiz after another. Devin, what's the best way to be prepared for a pop quiz? Study. Got lots of consistent study. That's the only way that you can be prepared for a pop quiz. Yeah. So, consistent communication with the source, which is Jesus. God has called you. He's called all of us. He has called us with a purpose. There's a purpose on your life. And then he is always speaking to us if we will tune in and listen. And what we do with that is what's going to make all the difference. My dad had a bracelet. You remember, but he had a bracelet in his drawer that said, try God. You remember that? And I always thought that was so strange as a kid because what I would hear, not from them, but I would hear this from time to time, and they would say, don't try me. Don't try me. When you were being disciplined. And so I always thought that was weird, like, don't try God. Like, why would you try him? But what that meant in essence was, you've tried everything else. Right? You can't do it. There's an emptiness. There's a hole inside of you. You need to try God. You need to get in touch with the one that can actually make a difference in your life.